There are moments in history when silence becomes a weapon and kindness becomes camouflage. Today, the world watches as Burkina Faso, a small landlocked nation once written off by the West, rises as the beating heart of a new African awakening. At the center of that awakening stands one man, President Ibrahim Traoré. Young, disciplined, and defiant, he has dared to speak the unspoken truth that Africa must no longer live on its knees. His speeches, echoing across deserts and radio waves, are not just words, they are fire. They ignite a generation that has grown tired of dependency and deception. But when a people begin to wake up, those who profited from their sleep become restless. Paris whispers, Washington listens, NATO watches. And in the midst of that silent storm, a new figure appears on the horizon, a woman with a smile that disarms, and a mission wrapped in silk. Her name is Claire Deo. To the cameras, she is the embodiment of compassion, the director of a Western NGO called Hope Forward. She speaks about empowering African women, about teaching them entrepreneurship, dignity, and choice. Her words melt hearts. Her presence opens doors. Every Western network applauds her as a humanitarian light in the dark corners of Africa. But behind that light hides a shadow. Claire Deo does not work for the women of Burkina Faso. She works for those who fear them. Her mission is not emancipation, but infiltration. Her organization, funded through layers of anonymous donors, traces its real command chain back to Ivory Coast, home to one of NATO's regional intelligence hubs. While President Ibrahim Traoré builds sovereignty from within, Claire Deo builds influence from below, among the women who shape families, guide villages, and anchor the nation's moral core. If she can sway them, she can sway the country. And that is how modern warfare looks in Africa today. No bombs, no tanks, just persuasion, data, and smiles. Through the guise of helping women, a new empire attempts to reclaim its lost control. Yet, something they did not predict was the resilience of the Burkinabe spirit, the quiet watchfulness of a people who have been deceived too many times before. For in the land of upright men, every act of kindness is weighed, every foreign gesture examined, every promise tested. So, when the winds of betrayal began to blow from the very hands that claimed to empower, Burkina Faso stood ready. And the man who would uncover it all without a single gunshot was the same man who promised that Africa would never kneel again. If you believe that Africa's awakening has already begun, stay until the end of this story, because what happened next will change how you see every humanitarian mission on this continent. When Claire Deo first arrived in Burkina Faso, the world saw an angel descending on the Sahel. She carried banners of hope, notebooks filled with promises, and cameras documenting her every step. Western outlets liked to show her hugging village women, teaching them about empowerment, and distributing sewing machines as if they were tools of liberation. To the untrained eye, she was the face of compassion. But to the watchful intelligence eyes of President Ibrahim Traoré, something felt off. Her organization, Hope Forward, claimed to work from Ouagadougou, yet all financial wires led to Ivory Coast, the regional hub for French and NATO intelligence. Every outreach meeting was live-streamed back to Europe. Every training workshop included subtle surveys about local leadership and security routines. She began recruiting bright, articulate women, local teachers, nurses, and civil servants, convincing them that the government was outdated and too militarized. To these women, she whispered ideas of a modern democracy, carefully painting Ibrahim Traoré as a temporary hero whose power must eventually give way to civilian reform. It was soft sabotage, masked in feminism. Unknown to her, the Burkinabe counterintelligence team had already tapped into her laptop. They traced encrypted files sent nightly to a server tagged EU Relief Ops, West Africa. The contents were not progress reports. They were maps, schedules, and dossiers. What Claire Deo collected under the banner of women's development was in fact the logistical skeleton of the nation's defense network. Meanwhile, Western media continued to celebrate her work. CNN called her the new Joan of Arc for African women. BBC praised Hope Forward as a bridge between humanitarian aid and women's empowerment. The hypocrisy was breathtaking and dangerous. Because behind every glowing headline was a darker narrative. A Western intelligence network learning how to dismantle African sovereignty through the very people it claimed to uplift. Traoré knew he could not expose her yet. He needed her to believe she was winning. So, he watched in silence as she dug deeper, unaware that every secret she sent to her superiors was already in his hands. But that was only the surface of the storm. What lay beneath would shake the illusion of humanitarian aid forever. Weeks turned into months. While Claire Deo spoke about training women to lead, she was unknowingly walking straight into the net that Ibrahim Traoré had designed. Every village meeting was recorded, every Western grant she received was marked, and each Burkinabe woman she tried to recruit had already been briefed by the intelligence unit, known as the Shield of Faso. Traoré's strategy was not confrontation, it was exposure through patience. He allowed Hope Forward to grow, to host conferences, to invite Western diplomats. He wanted them confident, careless, certain that the African government was too naive to suspect anything. But beneath the surface, the state built a mirror operation, Faso Women Rising, led by true local leaders, loyal to their people and the land. When Claire Deo organized a grand event in Ouagadougou to celebrate a new era of women's democracy, cameras from CNN, BBC, and Le Monde were already there. But so was the Burkinabe press, quietly instructed by Traoré to broadcast the full event live, unedited. It was the perfect stage. Halfway through her speech, full of Western slogans and emotional appeals, the lights dimmed. On the main screen behind her appeared encrypted images, intercepted messages, and satellite maps with her own digital signature. One after another, the files appeared. Her communications with French security officers, her funding statements signed by EU advisors, her covert reports labeling Traoré's government a militarized populist regime. The hall fell silent. Even the Western reporters froze. The so-called humanitarian icon stood motionless, her face pale under the stage lights. Then came Ibrahim Traoré. Calm, composed, he walked to the stage and faced the cameras. "Africa has always welcomed help," he said, his voice firm but steady, "but help that hides a dagger in its smile is no help at all." He paused, then turned to Claire Deo. "You came to teach our women freedom. Yet you came with chains of your own. You came not to liberate them, but to study them, to divide them, to turn them against their sons and brothers. That is not empowerment. That is infiltration." The audience erupted not with violence, but with a roaring unity that echoed through the capital. It was the sound of a people reclaiming their dignity. The next morning, international headlines burned with confusion. Western outlets tried to minimize the event, calling it a misunderstanding, while African networks hailed it as the night of truth. Burkina Faso, once painted as a fragile nation, now appeared as the heart of a continent, finally seeing through the West's disguise. From Washington to Paris, analysts scrambled to explain how a small Sahel nation outplayed an intelligence network disguised as charity. On Africa News, commentators praised Traoré's strategy as the quiet revolution of intelligence, a new doctrine of African sovereignty. The expulsion of Hope Forward triggered a domino effect. Neighboring countries began auditing Western NGOs. The illusion of humanitarian purity started to crumble. For decades, aid had been a currency of control. Now, it was exposed as the soft glove hiding an imperial hand. And through it all, Ibrahim Traoré never gloated. His address to the nation that evening was brief and solemn. "We do not reject the world. We reject deceit. We are not closing our doors, we are closing the back doors that were used to weaken us." The world had witnessed the unveiling of a global theater, and for the first time the African stage was directed by Africans themselves. Within 24 hours of the revelation, the world's diplomatic channels were in shock. The Claire Deo affair, as foreign media quickly named it, became a storm no one could contain. The West had long portrayed itself as the guardian of democracy and gender equality in Africa, but now that image was cracked wide open. In Washington, the State Department issued a cautious statement, calling the situation deeply regrettable, while reaffirming America's commitment to women's empowerment in the Sahel. Yet inside the Pentagon, analysts quietly reviewed the intercepted data and realized that Hope Forward had been part of a broader European intelligence collaboration, not an American one. The US was embarrassed, not only because it was caught off guard, but because the Burkinabe government had done what the CIA itself could not: expose covert European operations in real time. In Paris, the reaction was far harsher. French media attempted to defend Claire Deo, portraying her as a victim of African paranoia. But leaked documents soon contradicted those claims. By the end of the week, even Le Monde admitted there had been an unfortunate overlap between humanitarian work and political intelligence. It was a rare confession, and a painful one, for a former colonial power still struggling to keep influence in the Caribe, Sahel. Across Africa, however, the story ignited a wave of awakening. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, governments ordered reviews of foreign NGOs. In Ghana, a senator declared, "If Burkina Faso can stand up, so can we." On Africa News, commentators called it the moment Africa looked into the mirror and saw its own strength. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, something extraordinary happened. The very women whom Claire Deo had tried to recruit stood beside Ibrahim Traoré, declaring loyalty to their homeland. They transformed her empowerment program into a national movement called Mères du Faso, Mothers of Faso. Their mission: to rebuild villages, manage cooperatives, and teach political literacy rooted not in Western ideology, but in African values of community and honor. Western think tanks were stunned. The soft power tool they had long relied upon, cultural infiltration, had been turned into a fortress of unity. Universities debated the Burkina model. Analysts compared Traoré's maneuvering to post-colonial strategic genius. He had not only defeated an operation, he had redefined the language of resistance. For ordinary Americans watching from afar, it was confusing but magnetic. On YouTube and major news outlets, thousands began to ask, who is this young African leader who outsmarted the entire Western machinery? For the first time in decades, African news was not about famine or war. It was about intelligence, integrity, and pride. The fall of Claire Deo became more than a scandal. It was a mirror reflecting two worlds, one still trapped in old illusions of superiority, the other led by Ibrahim Traoré breaking free, not with weapons, but with truth. As European embassies quietly reviewed their humanitarian files, one line from Traoré's address to the United Nations echoed across the world: "If you truly wish to help Africa, come with clean hands, for we have learned to see what hides behind gloves." It was a warning and a declaration that Burkina Faso would never again be the playground of foreign saviors. In the weeks that followed, the United States found itself strangely captivated by a story it had never expected to admire. Across talk shows and political podcasts, Americans who once viewed Africa only through headlines of aid and conflict began to ask new questions. Who is Ibrahim Traoré? What exactly is happening in Burkina Faso? And why does this young leader speak with such moral conviction when so many others bow to global pressure? On Africa News, images of the Claire Deo revelation circulated daily, but now American analysts began to dig deeper. They realized that Traoré's defiance was not anti-Western, it was anti-hypocrisy. He had drawn a clear line between partnership and manipulation. "You cannot teach us freedom while holding the pen that writes our chains," he once said, a phrase replayed on CNN and quoted in the New York Times op-eds as the African Manifesto for Sovereignty. In the halls of Washington, something rare occurred: quiet respect. Senators who had never spoken of Burkina Faso suddenly referenced Traoré in hearings about US-Africa policy. One senior official reportedly admitted, "We underestimated the consciousness rising in the Sahel. They are no longer seeking permission, they are claiming destiny." American churches and universities began hosting debates about ethical foreign aid. Professors of political science asked their students whether help without humility was ever truly humanitarian. Slowly, Burkina Faso transformed from a small desert nation into a symbol of intellectual rebellion, proof that truth, when spoken with courage, can penetrate even the thickest propaganda walls. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré himself remained silent for several weeks. He refused interviews, declined awards, and told his ministers, "Let our actions speak louder than their microphones." His calmness unsettled global elites even more than his speeches had, because silence, when it comes from integrity, is the loudest sound in politics. By the time Africa News published its documentary, The Man Who Defied the System, Millions of Western viewers watched in awe. They saw a soldier-turned-leader who had exposed an entire network with nothing but intelligence, discipline, and faith in his people. For many in the West, this was the first time they looked at Africa not with pity but with respect, and that quiet shift, more than any diplomatic speech, marked the beginning of a new chapter in global awareness. Because now the world had seen what happens when truth fights back and wins. When the dust finally settled, the story of Burkina Faso and the downfall of Claire Deo had become more than a national scandal. It was a parable for the 21st century. For decades, Africa had been told it needed saving. That progress could only arrive wrapped in Western aid packages, signed by foreign consultants, and stamped with NGO logos. But now, under the quiet strength of Ibrahim Traoré, that illusion had shattered. Traoré's speech after the incident was brief, almost solemn. He did not celebrate victory. He warned. "We must guard our independence not only from the gun," he said, "but from the handshake that hides the chain." His words echoed across Africa news broadcasts, translated into a dozen languages, turning a local event into a continental awakening. Across the Sahel, nations began to question the price of help. In Nigeria, youth groups quoted Traoré on their banners. In Senegal, women's cooperatives replaced foreign-funded programs with local networks. In Mali and Niger, soldiers saluted him as le frère du désert, the brother of the desert. A new vocabulary was forming, one built on dignity, not dependency. In the West, some mocked it as nationalism, but others, especially ordinary Americans who had lived through wars sold as missions of freedom, understood. They saw in Burkina Faso a reflection of their own disillusionment, the growing awareness that truth is often hidden beneath the language of virtue. For them, Traoré's stand was not a rejection of the world, it was a demand for honesty within it. And that struck a chord, because whether in Ouagadougou or in Washington, every citizen knows that freedom means nothing if it can be bought, branded, or borrowed. As night fell over the Sahel, Ibrahim Traoré's words became a kind of prayer. "We will not kneel for help, we will rise for honor." And perhaps that is what truly frightened the old empires, not the weapons of Africa, but the awakening of its soul. So, to the viewers watching this story unfold, if you believe that freedom must be earned, not gifted, share this message. If you believe that the dignity of a nation is sacred, stand with those who defend it. Because today, Burkina Faso is no longer a headline. It is a mirror showing us what courage looks like when the world expects silence. God bless Burkina Faso. God bless Africa.